Well, this is one of those stories that is best labeled a mystery. And a mystery, as an author I was reading recently, is not something that helps you figure life out. A mystery is something to be lived. And so I invite you to come into this mystery with me now, this marvelous story, which if Sal were here, he'd say, remember, it's not to be taken literally. This is a symbolic story. And because it is, and because it's a mystery, and because myths and mysteries have levels of meaning, I want to share the level of meaning that I think is most wonderful about this story, and that is, it's our story too. It's not just about Jesus and Peter and James and John, or even Elijah and Moses. It is about them, but it's our story too. Even though it seems like something very far removed from our experience, I hope you'll see with me it really isn't. So let's look at the story closely and make it our story too. And it begins with Jesus taking his three closest friends, Peter, James, and John, and going up on a mountain to pray. And as Sal would say, a mountain is a symbol of high consciousness. That doesn't mean he didn't really go up a mountain, but that it's higher ground, as Peter led us in singing a few minutes ago. And so when he goes up on the mountain to pray, he's taking his friends and he's taking us on higher ground. He knows that he is about to go to Jerusalem, and that there he will be arrested and put on trial and tortured and beaten and crucified. How is he going to face that? And don't we all go through times in our lives when we are faced with such dreadful circumstances that we don't know how we're going to get through it? Including death, our own death, and the death of people we love, and the death that haunts the news reports. How do we face that? How do we deal with it? Well, we go up on a mountain to pray. And it's not just any kind of prayer. The appearance of Elijah and Moses, who were the two greatest figures in Jewish belief, representing the law, Moses, and the prophets, Elijah, the greatest of them, show us that in this prayer that Jesus was entering into, in communion with God, he was also in communion with the good will of God for the human race. Sometimes I think we who weren't brought up in the Jewish tradition lack what I consider to be their profound appreciation of the law and the prophets as a gift. That God wants justice. That God wants us people to live together in community well, not cheating, not lying, not stealing, not bearing false witness, loving one another and treating one another as we would want to be treated. That's what God's goodwill is for the whole human race. And that's why the psalmist sings that God's law is like sweeter than honey and more precious than rubies and much fine gold. When my good Jewish friend Lillian Siegel, I went to visit her in Philadelphia once, and On that Sabbath, of course I went to synagogue with her, it was Simcha Torah, which means rejoicing in the law, the Torah. And on that Sabbath service, the Torah, always beautiful scroll, is taken from the tabernacle and danced around the sanctuary with all the people. That gives you a little glimpse of what it means that Jesus was talking to Moses and Elijah. He was communing with the will of God, the good will of God. And he was coming to see in his prayer what he said after his resurrection to the disciples on the road to Emmaus, when they were so stunned and grieving about what had happened and didn't even recognize him. And he said, don't you realize that's what the law and the prophets said had to happen? So when we go up on the mountain to pray, when we face life's difficulties and even death, to be on higher ground is to commune with God and to seek God's perspective, which is always much bigger than our own, and God's comfort and God's love. So the story goes on to say when Jesus was doing that, he was transfigured. His face began to shine like the sun, and his garments became dazzling white. Well, see, that's what happens to you when you pray. Did you know that? Did you realize when you pray, when you go up the mountain to pray, and you focus on God rather than on the trouble, and fill your mind with the beauty and love and goodness of God, of course you're going to start shining. The Eastern Orthodox theologians suggest that Jesus always looked like that, but this was the only time the disciples got to see it. So may I suggest that's how we always look. That we are all shining beings, that we are all, our true selves are like Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. You are all, and I too, cleverly disguised as brilliant images of God. And we all have this surface self. You know, the self we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, will be in the future. Our jobs, our roles, our names, our weight, our blah. It's all surface. That's not your true self. That's your surface self. Good enough. But you are so much more. And once we hold that vision, not only of Jesus, but of the Christ on the mountaintop, shining like the sun, and that's for us, that's our true self too. No matter what's going on, and Jesus knew this. He knew his disciples were going to see this horrible stuff happening to him. And he wanted to give them a vision of the truth of being, which is that whatever you do to the body, you can't do it to the soul. Because our soul, our true self, the image of God, is not subject to death and sickness and all that stuff that we go through and Jesus went through in his human self. And there's a song that we sing a lot, which says exactly the same thing. The last verse. And I'm going to tweak the words a little bit so it's not when we've been there. When we have lived 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun. Come on, we have to sing it, right? Okay. When we have lived 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun. We've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. And that's the truth. So, at this point in the story, a cloud covers and surrounds them. Now, why would they be terrified by a cloud? Because this was not any old cloud. It should be capitalized in the text. This was the Shekinah, the cloud that led Israel through the Red Sea. And the cloud that surrounded Moses when he was given the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. And the cloud that filled the tabernacle when he went in to talk to God. And the cloud that made his face shine when he came out. And the cloud that led them all the way through the wilderness to the promised land. Never leaving them even when they were at their worst, and they could be pretty awful. And that cloud is the Shekinah, the feminine name in Hebrew for God's glory and presence. And that's the cloud we're in too when we turn our attention to God. That glory surrounds us. It's not something to be afraid of. It makes the sun's glory look like a little candle. The Shekinah. And we're all surrounded by that cloud of glorious love anytime we turn our mind or heart to God, anywhere, anyhow. And then Peter makes a really ridiculous suggestion, which is, let's try to hang on to this and let's make a project out of our prayers. Let's make 3 booths, one for Moses and one for Elijah and one for you, Jesus. You notice that Jesus did not respond to the suggestion. He wisely ignored it. And it does reveal a human proclivity to not deal with the glory by making prayer into a project and then claiming we're too busy to pray. When actually it's very simple. 2 steps. You can do it now. You can do it here. We do it right now in the sanctuary every time we come to church too. And we can do it every day. And step 1 is stop whatever you're doing and thinking and focus on God. One good way to focus on God is like Muslims do. They focus on the 100 qualities or names of God. 10 is actually will do the trick, I have found. Oh God, merciful, gracious, beautiful, just, compassionate, wise, comforting, loving, holy. What is it that I need to hear or do now? How should I face my life now? That's it. That's it. You do that in the morning. You do it at night. You do it in between. Whenever, especially whenever you're facing big difficulties. But do you realize we're going up the mountain and we're surrounded by the Shekinah and we're listening to the voice of God, which said to the disciples, "This is my beloved, my chosen. Listen to him. Really listen to him." And we do that here, don't we? Every Sunday we do that. And we do it here, praying and listening to one of Sal's wonderful homilies and having communion and giving. And it teaches us how to do that all week long. each of us in our own way. So there's another hymn I love. It has a verse that I'm not going to sing, but I'll say the verse for you. Let all things now living unite in thanksgiving to God the Creator, triumphantly raise, who fashioned and made us, protected and stayed us, who guideth us on to the end of our days. His banner is o'er us, God's love goes before us, a pillar of fire shining forth in the night, till shadows have vanished and darkness is banished, as forward we travel from light into light. Namaste.